The restaurant owner had been selling my recipes to international franchises as if they were his. When I confronted him, he said everything created in his company belongs to him. He didn't know I had every recipe dated, witnesses, and an intellectual property attorney. There are people who steal with a contract, who build the mechanism of the theft before you start working for them, who put clauses in the paper that sound reasonable when you sign them, because at that point you have no reason to imagine someone will use the fine print that way, who wait for you to build something valuable, and then invoke the fine print. I discovered it in the most unexpected way possible, because a chef in Hong Kong wrote me an email congratulating me on my seasonal menu she had seen at the restaurant that had just opened in her city. A restaurant I did not know existed, with a menu I recognized as mine from the first photo she attached. My name is Valentina. I am 38 years old. I am an executive chef specializing in contemporary Latin American cuisine, and for 6 years, I worked at a restaurant called Origin that was, at least in its public reputation, one of the references of avant-garde gastronomy in the city. The owner's name was Gerardo. He was 54 years old. He had founded Origin 12 years earlier as a small project that over time had grown to become the type of restaurant that appears on lists and receives international critics and generates the kind of prestige that in the gastronomic industry translates into real power. Part of that prestige, I learned too late, had been built by my hands, or more specifically, my recipes. I joined Origin 6 years ago with the excitement of someone who knows they're entering a place that can define their career. It was the type of position that in the industry you seek with years of dedication. Executive chef of a restaurant with real reputation, with budget to experiment, with the creative freedom that not all places give, and that for someone whose professional identity is built on creation is more valuable than almost anything else. Gerardo had given me that freedom from the beginning, or so it had seemed. The creative freedom, I also learned too late, had conditions I had not read carefully enough in the contract I'd signed. The email from a chef in Hong Kong arrived on a Tuesday in October. Her name was Michelle Chun. She had opened a contemporary Latin American cuisine restaurant in Hong Kong 3 months earlier. She had gotten my name from the documentation provided to her by the licensees who had sold her the menu concept. In that documentation, she told me in the email, my name appeared listed as the original creator of the dishes. But the license beneficiary, the one receiving royalty payments for the use of the menu, was a holding company whose legal representative was Gerardo. Michelle was writing to me because she was an honest person who believed I should know my creations were being commercialized and who wanted to make sure I was receiving the compensation that was due to me. I was not receiving it. I had not received a single cent for any license, because I did not know the licenses existed. I took 48 hours before making any move, not out of indecision, out of the kind of pause taken by someone who knows that what comes next requires being completely prepared before taking the first step. In those 48 hours, I did 3 things. First, I responded to Michelle, thanking her for her honesty and asking her to share any documentation she had about the license. She sent me the license contract she had signed. In that contract were the names of my dishes, the dishes I had developed, with the descriptions I had written, in a legal document I had never seen and from which I had never received anything. Second, I searched the internet. What I found in 2 hours of searching was something that if I had searched for earlier would have changed everything much sooner. There were at least 4 restaurants in 3 different countries operating under license of the Origin concept, all with menus I recognized because I had developed them, all open in the last 4 years. 4 years of licenses, 4 years of royalties, money generated by my work that had gone to Gerardo's company without my knowing it existed. Third, I called an intellectual property attorney whose name I had saved years earlier after hearing her speak on an industry panel about exactly this type of situation. Attorney Camila Torres had spent 12 years in intellectual property with specific cases in the gastronomic and creative sectors. When I described the situation, she listened for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 4 things. Whether I had documentation of the creative process of the dishes in dispute with dates prior to my contract with Origin. Whether I had witnesses to the development process of those dishes. whether I had the original contract I had signed with Gerardo, and whether I had read the intellectual property clauses, and whether I had access to the documentation Michelle had sent me. I said yes to everything. She was quiet for a moment. She told me the case was more favorable than I probably thought it was. The contract I had signed with Gerardo did indeed have an intellectual property clause establishing that creations developed within the work context at origin belonged to the company. It was the clause Gerardo was going to invoke. What Camila explained to me was that clause, though common in employment contracts, had important legal limits that many employers do not mention when they include it, and that many employees do not investigate when they sign it. The clause covers creations developed with company resources, during work hours, and in the specific context of assigned work. It does not cover creations the employee can prove to have developed independently, with their own resources and in their own time, even if those creations are later implemented at work. And it does not cover, under any reasonably interpreted circumstance, the commercial use of those creations to generate additional income through licenses without notification or compensation to the creator. That last part, Camila told me, was the strongest part of the case. My documentation was, according to Camila, of unusual solidity for this type of case. Since years before joining Origin, and throughout my time there, I had maintained a personal recipe notebook. A physical notebook with a date on every entry where I recorded each dish in development. The initial idea, the ingredients considered, the versions that did not work, the adjustments, the final result. I had systematically photographed every page of that notebook with my personal phone. The photographs had date and time metadata corresponding to the dates written in the notebook. It was authorship evidence with dates prior, in several cases, to implementation at Origin. I also had 3 people willing to testify about the creative process. 2 sous chefs who had worked with me on the development of several of the disputed dishes, and a specialty ingredient supplier with whom I had had conversations about the concept of some dishes before implementing them. And I had Michelle's email and a license contract she had shared with me. The confrontation with Gerardo I did in his office on a Thursday morning. I requested the meeting, telling him I wanted to discuss the direction of the menu for the next season. A completely ordinary reason that gave him no signal of what was coming. I arrived with my attorney. His face, when he saw us walking together, was the first response to everything that was going to follow. Camila took the floor from the beginning. She presented the case in an orderly way. The licensed restaurants, the license contracts, the dishes identified as my creations with dated authorship documentation, and the complete absence of notification or compensation toward me. Gerardo listened with the composure of someone who has had difficult conversations before and who knows that the way to handle them is not to show what he is thinking. When Camila finished, he said what I expected him to say, that the contract was clear, that everything created in the context of Origin belonged to Origin, that he had built the platform that had given value to my work, and that platform was the reason the licenses were possible. That my compensation was the salary I had received for 6 years. Camila responded with the precision of someone who had prepared that specific response. She explained the legal limits of the work-for-hire clause. She showed the authorship documentation with dates prior to implementation on several dishes. She presented the argument about unnotified commercial use for external income generation. And she told them we had 2 options: a retroactive compensation negotiation and future distribution agreement that recognized my authorship and participation in income from existing and future licenses, or a legal process that was going to be long, public, and whose outcome, given the weight of the available evidence, had a high probability of being unfavorable for Origin. Gerardo asked for time to speak with his attorneys. We gave him 1 week. That week was one of particular tension. I continued working at Origin with the normalcy the situation required, which was the kind of normalcy maintained with conscious effort when you know everything is about to change one way or another. On the 4th day, Gerardo called me. He told me he wanted to talk. The negotiation lasted 3 weeks. I'm not going to give exact figures because the agreement includes confidentiality terms about the specific amounts. What I can say is that the result included retroactive compensation for the 4 years of active licenses, formal recognition of my authorship in the documentation of all concepts in dispute, and a percentage of future income from licenses for those concepts while they remain in effect. It also included my resignation from Origin, which was an outcome I had anticipated and accepted before entering that meeting. There is no way to stay in a place after a conversation like that. I left Origin 5 months ago. In that time, I have been building something I have been postponing for 6 years because the gravity of fixed employment is hard to overcome. My own project. A small gastronomic development and research space where the dishes I create are mine from the beginning. Where intellectual property is documented from the first sketch. Where I have an attorney who reviewed every contract before I signed it. It is more uncertain than having a fixed salary. It is also completely mine. That difference, which I used to underestimate, is now the reason I wake up wanting to work every day. What I want you to take from this story has a very specific practical part for those who work in creative industries and a more general part for everyone. The specific part. If your work involves creation, whether design, cooking, writing, music, code, any form of intellectual production, read the intellectual property clauses of your contract before signing it. If you do not understand them, pay an attorney for an hour of consultation to explain them. That hour can save you years of uncompensated work. And document your creative process with dates from the beginning. Not out of distrust, but because if there is ever a dispute, dated authorship evidence is the difference between having a case and not having one. The general part. The specialized knowledge you have in your field is valuable. More valuable than the people who benefit from it frequently let you believe it is. Not necessarily because they are bad people, but because the compensation system in many creative industries is built in a way that favors whoever has the platform over whoever has the talent. Knowing that system is the first tool for not being a victim of it. If this story fired you up, comment. Do you read the intellectual property clauses when you sign a contract? Like if you believe creators deserve compensation for the commercial use of their work. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who works in a creative industry and has never thought about documenting their process. Practical tip. If you work in a creative industry, photograph or scan your sketches, notes, and development versions with the date activated. Use email to send yourself summaries of your creative process. Those date metadata can be authorship evidence in an intellectual property dispute. And before signing any contract that includes work-for-hire clauses, consult with a specialized attorney.